All right, back again. This time we're going to talk about Herbert Marcuse's essay on repressive tolerance, which was someone recommended this, and I thought, why not? Short, we can blast through this pretty easily. But before then, a few things to say. This can now be found on Spotify. I was having problems getting my podcast up there, but now it's there. So you can find these on Spotify going forward. Also, you can find it on iTunes or wherever else. There are links below. You can also follow me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy. You can find me on Patreon, of course, with the link down below. And I'd like to thank Amrit, Anshul, Boz, Honrick, James, John, Eust, Julio, Killswitch, Matt, and Paul, who have all been really helpful in keeping this going. Now, given everything that's going on in the world right now, most specifically in the West with Black Lives Matter, if you thought, hey, I'd like to contribute to me, maybe consider even not doing that. Throw a few dollars at the people that need it most, those people that are organizing movements in the streets. That would be really fantastic if you did that, because I certainly don't need money as much as those people. So please consider doing that, certainly before helping me. Is that it? I think that's it. Without further ado then, Herbert Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance, which is kind of topical. He's an old dead white guy, so that's a problem, but in this context. But what he's saying here, I think is good. For him, tolerance today means being satisfied with the present conditions, which are hegemonic. They are oppressive and they are repressive. They not only control our bodies, they control our urges and desires. So while we applaud tolerance as being, the hallmark of acceptance and maybe multiculturalism, of, a kind of cosmopolitanism, he says that we need intolerance to challenge the oppression that goes on today. We need to say no. We need to say this is not acceptable. So he takes aim at tolerance, and I think that this essay might come in a longer form that he calls a critique of pure tolerance. So he's critiquing tolerance here by saying that it's just become a kind of passive condition accepted by people who, just want to go with the motions, flow with the motions. Why is that? Going through the motions. People who just want to go with the flow. They don't want to criticize anything. They just want to go along for the ride or be along for the ride. And this he calls a kind of passive tolerance, where we just accept the world as it is, and we accept all the evils of it as is. And the way that we do that, or why we do that, is because we earnestly, in many cases, believe that the system delivers the goods. The system makes us happy. This system that we have, this late capitalist, patriarchal, white-centered, heteronormative, monogamous, you can go on and on, system we have is the best one we can ever have. And therefore, we must just be complacent. And we often forget that the only reason we enjoy these relative benefits to what people might have experienced in the past, at some points in the past, is because people took to the streets and said, we are not going to work 7 days a week. We are not going to work 6 days a week, which people still do to this day, to make ends meet. But these things came about, these relative progressions, these relative improvements came about through intolerance, by being able to say, no, I am not satisfied with that. So because we believe that the system is good, that we must have faith in it, we applaud passive tolerance because we see that as maintaining the system itself. So we celebrate it. everything we watch is about passive tolerance. We very rarely see things in which the system is challenged. We instead take our obsession with true crime or with murder mysteries, which turn every single issue into an individual, anomalous instantiation and not a broad systemic thing. And that is because it's so much easier to think of these very small movements, and we blow them up, and they are so much more interesting because they are anomalies to a system that we have for some reason come to accept and believe to be highly operational, one that is totally perfect. So these kind of anomalies then look that much brighter. They stand out that much more. So in a repressive society like the one we are in, and Marcuse would have been writing this, I guess, I don't know, probably in the late 50s or probably the early 60s. He says that in a repressive society like ours, our tolerant political outlets like voting, letter writing, the protests that we often have, maintain rather than challenge the system. So they are kind of like pressure valves, so that people feel like they have some kind of a voice in this vacuous system, as though there's actually no one listening. So good tolerance for him, these are his words, is tolerance. Tolerance is an end in itself only when it is truly universal, practiced by the rulers as well as the ruled. Now, for Marcuse, we'd want to do away with this idea of rulers, these ideas of rulers and the ruled, because that is, just the maintenance of the system itself. And so he taxonomizes, or he splits up repressive tolerance into two camps. So there's the one we've already discussed, which is passive tolerance, which essentially maintains the status quo. And that is us, not me, but people who live in their suburban big houses and they don't participate in any kind of political activism. They just go with the flow. They don't question anything. And this, I'm obviously generalizing. Not everyone does this, and people do it out of the suburbs too. I'm just using that as the kind of archetypal place in which no political action takes place. I cannot think of a time when there was a rally that broke out in some, suburban county or something like that. That just doesn't happen. So that's the first kind of form of repressive tolerance, passive tolerance. The second is what he calls active tolerance, which is extending tolerance in a nonpartisan way to Nazis, for example. So these are your freedom of speech people that are like, oh, we must accept hearing Nazis speak, or hearing, extremely violent people speak, just because we need to maintain this kind of Habermasian, name drop. I'm referring to Jürgen Habermas, who's part of the same group called the Frankfurt School as Herbert Marcuse. And one of Jürgen Habermas's ideas is about the public sphere. And what he says is that the public sphere is a place in which individuals come and discuss ideas. And it is through that we can see kind of real effective change come about through the kind of perfect communication fostered by this public sphere. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. And Marcuse is very critical of it, right? Because he doesn't have time for that. He doesn't have time for people who think that certain races are inferior or naturally inferior or anything like that. So of course, that's a kind of tolerance that he wants to criticize. And that's the second form of repressive tolerance. So for there to be freedom for him would mean being free among other free people, not to be free alone. Because that, you can't be free alone, because that would imply then that if everyone else is unfree, you're probably participating in their being unfree. And to do this means more than just tolerating repressive institutions, more going further or challenging our passive and active tolerance. So what we want to do then is to arrive at a kind of true tolerance. But to do so, we must be able to identify these false tolerances, the passive and active ones, because we want to arrive at a point in which we are liberated, which is one of his kind of key ideas. And I've done a couple of his books on here. I think if you want to know more about Marcuse, we have to move beyond false tolerance to arrive at a real tolerance in which people are actually accepted for who they are, and they aren't, exploited or turned into cogs of the kind of capitalist machine. So people have to be free to speak who they are. They have to be free to be able to act who they are, which means getting rid of the shackles of, capitalist working life or laboring that alienates us. And this is an idea he builds more, in a lot more detail in One Dimensional Man, another one of his books, and Eros and Civilization, another one. So it's difficult for us to put this into practice because one of the hallmarks, one of the signature promises of democracy is that it allows people to speak and it allows people to contribute to political life through their vote, through rallies and petitions, stuff like that. Now, it makes it, because we have these things, it makes it that much more difficult for us to, to recognize that these are only kind of cosmetic or superficial ways to challenge the system. So in order to do it, we have to get at the very positivity ostensibly promised by democracy, so that we can say, hey, while it might appear as though we have all these options, that we have all of this kind of potential, there is this kind of rigid underbelly to democracy that maintains capitalist exploitation, that maintains, the exploitation of new markets, that kind of maintains, property relations, that maintains the subordination of women in the home and in working life, and so on and so forth. And he recognizes that, he's going to be criticized for this because he's challenging democracy. And democracy is, for all intents and purposes, a shining moment in human history. It is a very wonderful thing. But that does not mean we cannot be very critical of what else is going on. And as a kind of tidbit of information about Marcuse that I heard from someone who studies Marcuse, I hope it's true or else I'm just lying to all of you. He used to have a grad student, I think, or some of his students, like sitting outside of his house with guns because he was like threatened so much for being like anti-democracy, anti-American, when he was probably teaching at Berkeley or something like that. And one thing that this system emphasizes is nonviolence. So the system and what is going on now with all the protests in the United States and Canada, for that matter, what we see is the system kind of saying, wow, nothing will come of this violence that is being done. Nothing can happen through it. But we might remember a few, last year, further back than that, when peaceful protests were happening by people kneeling in football stadiums, that was not acceptable either. And so we arrive at a kind of an impasse here where it seems like there's no acceptable solution offered by the system itself. So why not be violent? If voices are not going to be heard by people protesting peacefully, then there is no reason to think that their voices might not be heard with violence. And one of the presidents, I think, once said, like, if you make peaceful revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. which is or peaceful protest impossible, you make violent protest inevitable, something like that, which is a very prescient quote, one that really captures the essence of today. So all of this is very ironic, this emphasis on nonviolence, because that's never stopped powerful groups from using violence for its own ends in the past. Let's just list them off here. We got drone strikes, we got Abu Ghraib, we got Guantanamo, we got, police violence, so on and so forth. So what does it mean to challenge this system? What does it mean? How do we get at it? How do we challenge it? And in a sense, he says that it's a little bit relative in that every age or every kind of moment has its own solution, and we must be privy to that solution at any time. So this solution extends to the kinds of instruments available to us, the tools necessary to undo it. And it seems at this particular historical juncture, what is going on, at least we can hope, with the current protests and stuff, will mean is the enactment of one such movement or one such effort to undo oppression. But he does say something here that I have trouble with. So he says that these movements should be essentially spearheaded by, in his words, everyone in the maturity of his faculties as a human being, which is incredibly vague, and he doesn't expand upon that at all, because I don't know what maturity of faculties as a human being means. Does that mean someone who has, I just have no idea. Is it emotional, intellectual, physical maturity? It's unclear. And I get a little bit wary when we're talking about these things like the human being, like this kind of universal idea, which I worry when we think of this, we instantly have this kind of European model in mind. But he tells us that. I'm laying it out here, so if you have more to say on it, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. So this is essentially someone, for him, if I had to give a kind of definition, is someone who doesn't fall prey to oppressive desublimation, but that harnesses the power of the intellect to become aware of repression. So someone who, I guess this is maturity, someone who is aware of the way that the world tries to control them, the system controls them. And I would like to say, to define this other term, oppressive desublimation, which is a big term. So let's break it down. Sublimation is the act of transferring your desires into socially acceptable actions. So let's say you have a lot of libidinal energy, sexual energy that you'd like to have fulfilled, but you can't. So you transfer that into being a very productive person at work, for example. So you sublimate that desire, that urge, into something productive. When you desublimate, that means you go back to the roots. You go back to the thing that you wanted in the first place. Now, oppressive desublimation would be like if you turn those desires you had into, consuming copious amounts of like porn, for example, because that is not enacting the thing itself. It's a kind of artificial way that you are so kind of returning to reality. Snap back to reality. Yeah, I couldn't resist. And then here, he concludes by highlighting the kind of administered and coded world of economics and politics versus what he calls the free world of culture and tolerance. So these are the stakes. This is the battle that is going on. And we do well to fall on the side of, this kind of maturity, this cultural side, kind of wrapped up with a positive tolerance that is not acquiescent, that doesn't just give in to the system itself. But yeah, so that's probably pretty short there. If anyone has a problem with what I said, I'd like to hear about it. And also, please contribute to people. And if you can't contribute in the form of money, if you can be out with people, that'd be fantastic. If you can protest, if you can, show your support online would be great too. If you could start listening to Black content producers, that would be very good as well. And yeah, at the very minimum, just start listening. But yeah, that's it. Peace out.